Leonard Lurch Calloway stepped out of the courthouse a free man. The angry shouts of the public faded behind him as he walked through the crowd, unbothered. The trial had ended in his favor, evidence tampered with, procedures botched, and the justice system too tangled in its own mess to hold him accountable. He had won, but freedom did not mean acceptance. Back at the LCBO on Dundurn, his coworkers avoided him like the plague. Customers whispered, some even leaving when they saw him stocking shelves. Lurch didn't care. He had always been a grumpy man, and now he had even more reason to hate his job. Every time someone asked him where the whiskey was, he had to resist the urge to snap. The dull routine, the fluorescent lights, the endless small talk, he despised it. He counted the hours until he could leave, slipping into the night where he truly felt alive. His summer job at Kings Forest Golf Course brought little relief. The early mornings used to be peaceful, but now he felt eyes on him. The other staff no longer chatted with him. Golfers stayed away. He spent most of his shifts alone, either tending to the greens or playing solo rounds in the misty dawn. He muttered to himself more often now, chuckling darkly at private jokes only he understood. Then, the killings started again. The first was a security guard at Jackson Square Mall, found in a stairwell with his throat slit. The second, a woman in the Lime Ridge Mall parking lot, her lifeless body slumped in the driver's seat of her car. A man at the Westdale Food Basics, his stomach carved open near the loading dock. The overnight worker at the Tim Hortons off Wentworth, slumped over the register, blood dripping into the coffee pot. Denninger's Food Market was next, a butcher impaled by his own knives. The police were frantic, but without physical evidence, the cases remained unsolved. The city whispered Lurch's name, but no one dared say it too loud. Realizing the tension in Hamilton was becoming unbearable, Lurch transferred to a new LCBO in Burlington. The move changed nothing. Coworkers still avoided him, but he didn't care. Burlington had fresh hunting grounds. The Queen's Head, the Dickens, the Poacher, places filled with unsuspecting late-night drinkers. A bartender from the judge and jury vanished after closing. A man leaving the Poacher one night never made it home. At the Black Bull, a young woman was found in the parking lot, her body stuffed in a trunk. Burlington, a city that once felt safe, was now drowning in fear. Lurch continued as he always had, playing golf, selling liquor, watching, waiting. And no matter how many times the bodies turned up, no matter how many people suspected him, there was nothing the police could do. They would never catch him again.
As the wail of sirens pierced the humid Burlington night, Leonard Lurch Calloway felt a thrill that mixed with a cold, calculated calm. The sound was coming closer, each shriek a reminder that fate, however reluctant, had caught up with him. But Lurch was not one to be easily rattled. A half-smile crept over his face as he slammed his fist against the steering wheel of his battered pickup. The red taillights of a police cruiser briefly reflected in his rearview mirror. He accelerated smoothly, merging onto the deserted back road that ran parallel to the city's industrial district. In the vehicle's silence, his mind began to churn through memories of past escapes, a lifetime of evasion, each close call sharpening his instincts. Tonight, however, the slip of evidence in his car had ignited an unusual spark of exhilaration, the promise of a challenge that made his heart beat in tune with the looming danger. As he drove, the moon hung low, casting distorted shadows over the cracked pavement. The pickup rattled along the rough road as Lurch's thoughts drifted to the fateful mistake. A tiny smear of blood, the only trace of evidence he'd carelessly left behind in the trunk. For a man who had prided himself on leaving no trace, this oversight was as foreign as it was dangerous. But in his mind, it was just another puzzle to solve, a minor inconvenience in a life defined by survival. At a forgotten intersection, Lurch pulled over into an abandoned warehouse complex, a relic of Burlington's industrial boom now left to decay. Inside a derelict building, he slid the pickup's door open and eased out, his boots crunching on shattered glass and rusted metal. The building, dark and cavernous, had long been his refuge. He stepped silently through the hallways, his breath visible in the chill air. Here, away from prying eyes and relentless sirens, he could plan his next move. Inside the building's deepest recesses, a small makeshift hideout awaited him. Walls layered with old newspaper clippings and crime reports bore witness to Burlington's descent into fear and to Lurch's own dark legend. He dropped his keys on a rickety table and sank into a threadbare chair. His eyes, shadowed beneath thick brows, flicked over the scattered evidence of his past deeds. There were newspaper cuttings that dubbed him the Burlington Reaper, scribbled notes about the victims, and faded photographs taken by a curious bystander one rainy night. Now the taste of near capture was bitter on his tongue. The trace of blood was the one imperfection in an otherwise immaculate record. But Lurch was no amateur. He already began formulating a plan to erase that mistake. If it meant risking another dangerous escapade, he was prepared to walk that line once more. In a quiet precinct on the outskirts of Burlington, Detective Marisol Rivera stared intently at the evidence board in the station's dimly lit war room. For months, Burlington had been gripped by a series of grisly murders that defied logic and shook the community. Each case was a thread, and Rivera believed they were all connected, a tapestry of violence spun by one calculating hand. Her eyes fell on a series of photographs pinned next to fragments of evidence. The shattered remains of a security guard's badge from Jackson Square Mall, a piece of torn fabric found at the scene near Limeridge Mall, and the faint smear of blood that had been collected from the trunk of an unidentified car. It was that last piece that troubled her most. Forensic analysis had come up with a partial DNA profile, and while it wasn't conclusive, it pointed towards someone who was not entirely beyond the reach of the law.
Rivera's mind raced with the implications. How could someone who had already slipped through the judicial cracks be responsible for such heinous acts? She pored over witness testimonies, revisited surveillance footage, and traced the movements of a mysterious figure who seemed to be omnipresent in the scenes of these crimes. Every detail hinted at a man with a history, a man who had been under the radar until now. Her intuition told her that the trace in the pickup's trunk was a turning point. If she could just link it conclusively to one suspect, the case might finally crack wide open. Rivera spent long hours poring over case files and forensic reports, determined to connect the dots. Meanwhile, in the dim corridors of Burlington's criminal underworld, whispers of Lurch grew louder. But for Detective Rivera, the hunt was personal, a relentless pursuit that left no stone unturned. Back in his hideout, Lurch had retreated into a restless stupor. The adrenaline of the chase had faded, replaced by a cold introspection. He remembered the day he first tasted freedom after the trial, the moment when he had realized that the law was a paper shield he could easily pierce with his own brand of justice. But now, with the blood trace looming like a shadow over his reputation, he questioned if his meticulous control was finally slipping. He paced the narrow room, his heavy boots echoing on the concrete floor. Each step brought with it memories of the victims, faces, names, and moments that blurred together in a macabre montage. He was a predator in a world that had become too observant, too eager to unmask the monster behind the myth. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, a dark satisfaction stirred within him. The thrill of being hunted, of eluding capture, was almost intoxicating. Lurch knew that if he were to continue his work, he needed to be more cautious. He meticulously began cleaning his hideout, erasing any potential evidence that might tie him to the latest string of murders. He gathered tools from a rusted cabinet, gloves, solvents, and a battered toolbox. With each measured movement, he transformed his temporary sanctuary into a sterile, untraceable space. As he worked, his mind wandered to the people whose lives he had taken, each one a reminder of his own cold detachment. The faces of the security guard, the woman at Limeridge, the butcher at Denninger's, and countless others haunted his thoughts. They were, after all, just numbers, in a ledger he kept hidden behind a mask of indifference. Yet a small voice within him, perhaps the ghost of the man he once was, wondered if even he might one day regret these choices. But regret was a luxury he could not afford. His survival depended on his ability to remain untraceable, to stay one step ahead of the relentless Detective Rivera and her team. And so, as the night deepened, Lurch made his decision. He would disappear into the labyrinthine back alleys and forgotten corners of Burlington, only to resurface when the heat had died down. It was time to relocate his operations, to reinvent himself yet again. The following morning, as a pallid sunrise crept over Burlington, Lurch slipped away from his hideout. He drove through the city's quiet streets, passing closed storefronts and abandoned warehouses. His destination was a nondescript motel on the outskirts of the city, a place where he could vanish for a while, regroup, and plan his next move without attracting unwanted attention. The motel, a relic of a bygone era, offered cheap rooms and a degree of anonymity that suited him perfectly. Inside his dingy room, Lurch sat at a rickety desk and began to draft a new narrative for his life. In his mind, he was not merely a murderer. He was an artist of terror, a curator of chaos who had mastered the delicate balance between life and death. He composed lists of potential new targets, places where he could blend in with Burlington's nocturnal rhythm. The city was vast and its secrets many. There were countless venues, the hidden bars, the deserted parking lots of malls like Westdale and Limeridge, the forgotten back streets near the Tim Hortons on Wentworth. Each location had its own story, its own potential for horror. In the flickering light of a single desk lamp, Lurch reviewed maps of Burlington and its surrounding neighborhoods. He marked the locations of his past crimes with clinical precision, drawing lines between each incident, identifying patterns that he himself had established. But as he did so, an unsettling realization dawned on him. His operations, once confined to Hamilton and later Burlington, were becoming too predictable. The police were learning, adapting. Even Detective Rivera's relentless pursuit was beginning to close in on the pattern he had so carefully cultivated.
He resolved that his next phase would be different. No more overt displays in crowded public spaces. Instead, he would target more secluded spots, quiet roads, abandoned warehouses, even the outskirts of well-known establishments like the LCBO in Burlington, where he had once worked. The idea was to strike in places where evidence would be impossible to trace, where the natural decay of time would erase his sins. Over the next several weeks, Burlington became a chessboard, and Lurch its secret master. Late one autumn night, under a sky smeared with ink-black clouds, he struck again. This time his target was an isolated office building in the industrial zone near the Queen's Head pub. The building, long abandoned and overgrown with ivy, provided the perfect stage. Lurch moved like a specter through the dark corridors, his presence barely a whisper against the silence of decay. Inside, he found his victim, a night shift security guard whose routine patrol had brought him to the building for reasons unknown. The guard's eyes widened in terror as Lurch emerged from the shadows, and in a moment that lasted only seconds, the life was snuffed out with a quiet, almost polite finality. Lurch left no trace except for a single, neatly folded handkerchief, a macabre signature that he would later dismiss as mere irony. The following morning, the discovery of the body sent ripples of shock through the already terror-stricken community. Detective Rivera arrived at the scene, her face set in grim determination. She examined the handkerchief, a rare, vintage piece that belonged to a collection only a few could possess, and a clue began to form in her mind. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it hinted at a deliberate message. Lurch was not random. He was intentional. Rivera's instincts told her that the killer was orchestrating a larger plan, one that would soon come to fruition if she did not act quickly. Rivera intensified the investigation, assembling a task force and re-examining every case file that had been linked to the Burlington murders. Late-night stakeouts, forensic retesting, and countless hours of digital surveillance soon bore fruit. A pattern emerged, one that pointed directly to a man who had been present in every major incident. Rivera's team began to piece together snippets of footage from various security cameras. The shadowy figure seen flitting in and out of the frame, the gloved hand that left behind traces at each crime scene, and the quiet manner in which each victim was dispatched were all threads that led back to one conclusion. Leonard Calloway was orchestrating these horrors. Yet even as Rivera's net tightened, Lurch was already adapting. His new phase of operations was his most daring yet, a blend of calculated brutality and the art of disappearing without a trace. In the small hours of one particularly bitter winter night, Lurch set his sights on a high-profile target. At a renowned Burlington bar, the Poacher, where local patrons gathered for cheap pints and louder conversations, he planned to create a spectacle that would shock the city to its core. Inside the Poacher, laughter and clinking glasses filled the warm, dimly lit space. Unbeknownst to the revelers, Lurch had slipped in earlier in the evening, concealed by the shadows behind the bar. He watched, his eyes flickering with a detached amusement as patrons told stories and shared secrets over their drinks. It was here, amidst the mundane merriment, that his next victim would fall. A middle-aged man, known in local circles for his contentious opinions and brash demeanor, became the unwitting target. Lurch approached him with the quiet deliberateness of a seasoned predator. A few whispered words, a sudden gloved hand, and the man's life was extinguished in an instant. The body was then carefully hidden beneath a table, the evidence of the murder artfully obscured until someone would inevitably stumble upon it in the morning. By dawn, panic had erupted in Burlington yet again. The city was gripped by paranoia, every dark corner and shadow suspected of harboring the Burlington Reaper. Detective Rivera, now more determined than ever, doubled down on her efforts. Every lead, every small detail, was scrutinized, and her obsession with catching Lurch verged on the personal. She recalled the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, the lives lost, the terror inflicted, and the promise she had made to the victims to bring their killer to justice. Meanwhile, Lurch's double life began to fracture under its own weight. The very existence of routine had become a liability. The LCBO in Burlington, once a mere backdrop to his dark exploits, was now a choke point. Every shift he worked, every mundane interaction, carried the risk of exposure. His co-workers' avoidance had turned into open hostility, and even the few regular customers who once glanced his way now did so with palpable fear.
During one particularly fraught evening at the LCBO, as Lurch stocked shelves in near silence, a young employee named Marcus inadvertently dropped a bottle of wine. The crash echoed through the quiet store, and in that moment of distraction, Lurch's mind raced. He realized that every small mistake, every unintentional slip, was a potential thread that Rivera could unravel. Desperate to maintain his cover, Lurch began to sever ties with the familiar. He arranged for a transfer, quietly and without fanfare, to a different branch of the LCBO, one located in a quieter, less scrutinized part of Burlington. With the move came a period of isolation. Lurch found solace in the deserted backrooms of the new store, where he could reflect on his actions and meticulously plan his next steps. The isolation, however, bred a strange kind of introspection. In the silence of his new routine, Lurch began to question the inexorable spiral of violence he had set in motion. There were moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible, when he wondered if there was a path back from the abyss he had chosen. But those thoughts were quickly drowned out by the thrill of the hunt and the satisfaction of knowing that, for now, he remained untouchable. One overcast afternoon, as the city's residents went about their cautious routines, a breakthrough occurred that would send shockwaves through the investigation. Detective Rivera received an anonymous tip, a cryptic message delivered by an unknown courier. The note, scrawled in hurried handwriting, contained a single sentence: "Look in the shadows of the past, and you will find his next step." The message haunted Rivera. It hinted at a long-forgotten location, a relic of Burlington's turbulent history. She pored over old maps and historical records, searching for any landmark that might correlate with the cryptic clue. Days later, her research led her to an abandoned train station on the city's outskirts, a once bustling hub now reduced to crumbling platforms and rusted tracks. Rivera's instincts screamed that this station was Lurch's next target. With her team assembled, she staked out the station under the cover of darkness, determined to catch the elusive killer in the act. The station, cloaked in an eerie silence broken only by the distant murmur of passing trains, became the stage for a confrontation that neither side could avoid. As midnight approached, a lone figure emerged from the shadows of the station's dilapidated waiting room. It was Lurch, his silhouette tall and imposing against the flickering lights of the old platform. Unaware of the detectives closing in, he began his methodical preparations, laying out tools, checking his concealed weapons, and scanning the empty platform with a predator's vigilance. Rivera's heart pounded as she watched from a distance, every muscle taut with anticipation. This was it, the moment of reckoning. The station was silent save for the sound of Lurch's measured breathing. With her team in position, Rivera signaled silently. They moved as one, determined to intercept the killer before he could strike again. But Lurch was not so easily cornered. As the officers closed in, he sensed the change in the air, a subtle shift that set off alarms honed by years of survival. In a fluid, almost balletic motion, he disappeared into a network of service tunnels that ran beneath the station. The police, caught off guard, fanned out into the darkness, their flashlights slicing through the gloom. For Lurch, the tunnels were an old friend. They were dark, narrow passages that smelled of damp concrete and decay, but they were his escape route. As he moved through the labyrinth, he could almost feel the presence of his former victims, their silent voices urging him on. The chase, though brief, was a cat-and-mouse game that reawakened his long-dormant instincts. Rivera, frustrated by the vanishing act, vowed not to let him slip away again. The anonymous tip had been both a blessing and a curse. It had lured him into a trap that he might never escape if he wasn't careful. The detective's resolve hardened. She would comb every inch of Burlington's hidden corridors, follow every lead, until Lurch was finally brought to justice.
Emerging from the tunnels hours later, Lurch found himself at the edge of Burlington's industrial park, where the night gave way to the bleak pre-dawn light. The near miss at the station had left him both wary and invigorated. He knew that the game had changed. The police were no longer content to let him remain a ghost in the shadows. They were hunting him now, with a renewed determination that threatened to unravel the tapestry of his carefully constructed life. For the next several days, Lurch moved like a wraith through the city. He adopted new disguises, altered his routes, and even changed the methods of his killings. Each act was executed with a ruthless precision designed to throw off Rivera's investigation. But despite his best efforts, he could feel the net tightening, a lingering pressure that crept into his thoughts and invaded his once unassailable confidence. One foggy evening, as Lurch stalked through a deserted alley behind a row of closed storefronts near Westdale, he encountered a scene that jolted him out of his solitary focus. A young woman, clearly out of place in the shadowed gloom, was huddled beside a dumpster. She appeared frightened, her eyes wide as she scanned the surroundings. In another life, Lurch might have felt a pang of remorse or a moment of hesitation. But that was not who he was anymore. The figure before him was simply another potential target, a distraction, a risk he could not afford. Yet as he advanced, a flicker of uncertainty passed over his face. The woman looked directly at him, her gaze not filled with terror, but with a quiet, defiant challenge. In that split second, time seemed to slow. Lurch hesitated. The moment was charged with an intensity he hadn't felt in years, a reminder of the humanity he'd long since suppressed. Before he could decide her fate, a sharp voice rang out from behind him. "Stop right there!" Detective Rivera emerged from the shadows, her weapon trained on Lurch. In that instant, everything changed. The young woman used the distraction to vanish into the night, and Lurch found himself face to face with the relentless embodiment of Burlington's justice. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Rivera's eyes burned with a mix of fury and determination as she demanded, "Leonard Calloway, don't move!" The air crackled with tension as Lurch's mind raced. His carefully constructed persona, the master of evasion, had finally met its match in Rivera's unwavering resolve. But Lurch was not a man to be cornered so easily. With a sudden burst of movement, he dove into a side alley, using the darkness as his shield. Rivera fired a warning shot, the sound echoing off the brick walls. But Lurch was already gone. The chase resumed, a relentless pursuit through narrow alleys, deserted streets, and the labyrinth of Burlington's backroads. Every step, every turn was a calculated risk. Rivera pursued him relentlessly, her instincts as honed as his, both of them driven by forces that transcended mere duty. For Lurch, the chase was not just about survival. It was a twisted dance of power, a final assertion of control over a world that had long sought to crush him. And for Rivera, it was a mission to reclaim the city's safety, to restore order amid chaos. In the coming hours, the chase wound through abandoned warehouses and overgrown lots, past shuttered storefronts and silent, haunted residences. Lurch's mind flashed back to the faces of his victims, the echo of their silent accusations mingling with the pounding of his own heart. Yet even as he ran, he clung to the belief that he could outwit the law one final time. The pursuit reached a fever pitch near an old decommissioned rail yard, a grim, sprawling complex that had once been the lifeblood of Burlington's industry. Here, in the labyrinth of rusted tracks and crumbling platforms, the final confrontation loomed. Rivera, with her team in tow, advanced cautiously, every sense alert to the slightest movement. Lurch, now trapped between the unforgiving steel of the rail cars and the relentless pursuit of the law, realized that escape was narrowing to a single desperate possibility. His mind raced through options, each one a gamble with life or death. In a moment of grim resolve, he made his decision. If he could not vanish entirely, he would at least inflict a final, devastating blow on those who had chased him to the very end. In the chaos of the rail yard, Lurch set a trap. Using his intimate knowledge of the decaying infrastructure, he rigged a section of the old tracks with makeshift explosives, salvaged from abandoned construction sites and repurposed into instruments of retribution. The plan was simple: lure Rivera into a confined space where the explosion would trap her and buy him precious moments to disappear. The confrontation was swift. As Rivera rounded a corner, Lurch appeared, his eyes glinting in the weak light. "It's over, Detective," he said quietly, his voice calm despite the stakes. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, the tension palpable in every frozen second. Then, as Rivera lunged forward, her determination evident, Lurch activated the trap. A deafening explosion tore through the rail yard, a shock wave that rattled concrete and sent debris flying in every direction. In the ensuing chaos, screams and the shrill sound of shattering glass filled the air. When the dust began to settle, Rivera was nowhere to be seen. Only a smoking crater remained, a silent testament to Lurch's desperate gamble. For a brief, agonizing moment, Lurch allowed himself to wonder if he had gone too far. The explosion was meant to be a diversion, a way to ensure his escape, but it had also severed any hope of a controlled, calculated exit. In the ruins of the rail yard, the boundary between predator and prey blurred, and the price of his freedom grew ever steeper. As the city awoke to the news of the rail yard explosion, Burlington was plunged into a state of shock and mourning. The headlines were a mix of horror and outrage, and the citizens demanded answers. Detective Rivera's absence from the scene only intensified the mystery. Was she trapped beneath the rubble, or had she escaped, injured but alive? The uncertainty added fuel to an already raging fire of public fear. Rivera herself had not perished. Wounded but unbowed, she managed to crawl away from the devastation, her will to continue the pursuit burning brighter than ever. Clutching a bloodied arm and fighting through the pain, she radioed for backup. In that moment, every personal grudge, every sleepless night spent poring over evidence, crystallized into a singular focus: bringing Lurch to justice, no matter the cost. Lurch, meanwhile, vanished into the sprawling underbelly of Burlington. The explosion had given him a precious window, a brief moment of respite to disappear into the maze of city streets, abandoned buildings, and forgotten tunnels. With his heart pounding in his ears and his mind racing, he moved with a singular purpose. Every footstep echoed with the weight of his past sins and the uncertainty of his future. In the days that followed, Burlington was left to pick up the pieces. The explosion at the rail yard became a symbol of the chaos that had consumed the city. While law enforcement worked tirelessly to secure the area and rescue any survivors, whispers of Lurch's involvement grew louder. His calculated signature, the dark imprint of his presence, was now intertwined with a city's nightmare. For Detective Rivera, the loss of the rail yard confrontation was a painful setback, a reminder that the killer was always one step ahead. In the sterile corridors of her hospital room, as she recovered from her wounds, she plotted her next move. The city's safety depended on catching Lurch, and she was prepared to devote every resource at her disposal to that end. The chase had become personal, an unyielding war between a relentless pursuer and a master of evasion. Lurch's life had become a precarious balancing act, one that demanded constant reinvention. His operations were no longer confined to a single neighborhood or a predictable pattern. He shifted his focus to new, uncharted territories, planning his moves with the precision of a chess master. There were rumors of a new target in the fringes of Burlington's industrial district, whispers of a wealthy magnate who had made enemies in high places. Lurch found the idea tantalizing, a challenge that would test not only his skill, but also the limits of his control over the forces arrayed against him. As winter deepened, the nights grew longer and darker, the cold seeping into every crevice of the city. Under the cloak of this relentless night, Lurch orchestrated a series of meticulously planned crimes that would leave Burlington trembling. A high-end gala at one of the city's renowned hotels became a macabre stage for his artful cruelty. In the midst of champagne and laughter, a series of discreet, lethal strikes left the partygoers unaware of the true horror unfolding until it was too late. By the time the authorities arrived, the trail had vanished into thin air, a testament to Lurch's uncanny ability to erase his own footprints. Yet every act of calculated brutality was a risk. With each life he claimed, the scrutiny increased. Rivera's investigation, though set back by the explosion, began to close in again. The anonymous tip that had once hinted at the train station was now followed by more cryptic messages and stray pieces of evidence linking Lurch to every major incident. The pressure mounted until it seemed that every dark corner of Burlington whispered his name. In a daring move to reset the board, Lurch made a radical decision. He would temporarily leave Burlington altogether, retreating to a safe house hidden in the outskirts of the city. There, in a secluded cabin surrounded by dense woods and a frozen lake, he could plan without interference. The isolation was both a curse and a blessing, an opportunity to reassess his strategy while the threat of discovery loomed larger than ever. At the cabin, the isolation brought a torrent of memories. Lurch found himself staring at the faded photographs he had stowed away, remnants of a past that now seemed as distant as a half-remembered dream. Faces of loved ones long lost, times when hope had been a possibility, and moments of weakness that he had long since buried beneath layers of indifference. In the silence of that winter retreat, a small part of him wondered if there was a chance for redemption. But that thought was quickly crushed by the relentless pursuit of survival, a reminder that he was the architect of his own darkness. The safe house offered a temporary reprieve, but it was also a ticking time bomb. Detective Rivera's team had not given up, and whispers in the criminal underworld hinted at a fugitive mastermind hiding in the frozen wilderness. Rivera herself was undeterred by the setback. Fresh from her recovery and fueled by an unquenchable resolve, she expanded the investigation, coordinating with regional task forces to track any sign of Lurch. The safe house would not remain hidden forever. As spring began to thaw the bitter winter, the tension in Burlington reached a fever pitch. New bodies appeared, more gruesome and enigmatic than before. Each murder was accompanied by a cryptic token, a small object left behind as if to taunt the investigators. A silver key at one scene, a broken watch at another, a single red rose at yet another. It was as if Lurch was playing a sinister game, a twisted riddle that challenged Rivera and her team to decipher his final message before the city was swallowed whole by terror. Rivera's investigation now resembled a high-stakes chess match, with every move scrutinized and every mistake potentially fatal. Late one night, as she pored over the scattered clues in her dimly lit office, she realized that the tokens might be the key to unlocking Lurch's mind. A window into the rationale behind his brutal artistry. The symbols were both random and deliberate, a signature that hinted at a deep-seated code. With renewed determination, she began to map out the connections, hoping that somewhere among the seemingly disparate clues lay the breakthrough that would finally bring Lurch down. The days turned into weeks, and the city of Burlington oscillated between a tense calm and bursts of panic as another murder was announced. Lurch, ever the master of reinvention, returned to his old haunts, blending into the life he had built through blood and solitude. The LCBO, the golf course, and the dark alleys of the city remained his playground, a stage upon which he enacted his gruesome theater of fear.
In one final, audacious act designed to secure his legacy, Lurch planned a public event that would shock Burlington to its core. He targeted a renowned charity gala held at a refurbished historical theater in the heart of the city, a symbol of Burlington's resilience and community spirit. On the night of the gala, under a canopy of glittering chandeliers and amidst the hum of polite conversation, Lurch moved like a phantom. Disguised in a tailored suit that masked his true identity, he infiltrated the event unnoticed, blending seamlessly with the high society that gathered to celebrate hope and progress. As the night progressed, subtle signals unfolded, a misplaced glass here, a whispered conversation there, and soon chaos erupted. A series of orchestrated events led to a deadly cascade of terror. A security detail was compromised, guests were ushered into panic-stricken corridors, and in the confusion, Lurch struck with calculated precision. By the time the authorities managed to regain control, several high-profile figures lay dead, and the theater was drenched in an atmosphere of unrelenting horror. In the aftermath of the gala, Burlington was left reeling. The city that had once prided itself on its resilience now trembled under the weight of a terror that seemed unstoppable. Detective Rivera, though bruised and battered from her previous encounters, vowed that this would be the final act in the macabre drama. Every piece of evidence, every cryptic token left behind, now coalesced into a narrative that pointed inexorably to one man. For Lurch, the gala was both a statement and a final gambit, a declaration that he would never be confined by the boundaries of society, that even in the face of overwhelming pursuit, his will was unbreakable. Yet, in the quiet moments after the carnage, as he watched the city sink into despair from a safe distance, a sliver of doubt gnawed at him. Had he gone too far this time? Was there a point of no return? The answer, as always, was buried deep in the darkness of his own soul, a darkness that had become both his armor and his curse. As the investigation reached its crescendo, the cat-and-mouse game between Detective Rivera and Leonard Lurch Calloway escalated to a fevered pitch. In the weeks following the gala, Rivera's tireless efforts began to pay off. The cryptic tokens were decoded one by one, revealing a pattern that linked back to Lurch's earliest crimes, an intricate tapestry woven from his life's darkest chapters. Every clue seemed to whisper a single truth. Lurch was orchestrating a final masterpiece, one that would forever change the face of Burlington. Rivera organized a covert operation to intercept the killer before he could strike again. Her team combed through every corner of the city, from the abandoned warehouses in the industrial park to the forgotten subways beneath the streets. The net was closing in, and for the first time in months, the killer's shadow felt less omnipotent. In a daring late-night operation, Rivera's task force raided a suspected safe house in the outskirts of Burlington, a decrepit farmhouse rumored to shelter those on the run. The operation yielded scant evidence: a tattered journal with cryptic entries, a collection of photographs of old crime scenes, and a map marked with various locations across the city. In the margins of the journal, one entry caught her eye, a hurried scrawl that read, "The final act awaits in the heart of the city." It was a message that both chilled and energized her. The final act was imminent. Lurch, aware of the growing pressure, knew that the endgame was near. His mind, forever calculating and unyielding, began to work out the final steps of his grand design. He would orchestrate one last event, a culmination of all the terror he had wrought, a spectacle so intricate and devastating that it would cement his legacy as the Burlington Reaper. On a cold, starless night, as the city slept under a blanket of uneasy silence, Lurch moved once again. Disguised in a nondescript coat and hat, he navigated through the labyrinthine back streets with a singular purpose. His destination was the old LCBO building, a relic that now served as a decaying monument to his former life. Inside, he had planted the seeds of his final masterpiece. Hidden behind false walls and abandoned stockrooms, his intricate network of traps and signals was set to trigger a chain reaction of chaos. It was there, in that decaying edifice, that Lurch planned to tie together every loose end. The old grudges, the final tokens, the silent voices of his past victims. In his mind, every detail was perfect. He had anticipated the detective's moves, manipulated the very fabric of the city's fear, and now, as he prepared to vanish into the night once more, he allowed himself a moment of dark satisfaction. Yet the final act was a gamble, a risk that, if miscalculated, would bring the full force of the law crashing down upon him. In that fleeting moment before the triggers were set off, Lurch's thoughts wandered to the path that had led him here. Every murder, every near miss with capture, every whispered accusation in the dark had been a step along this dangerous road. And as he stepped away from the LCBO, leaving behind the chaos that he had carefully designed, he wondered if this final act would be his ultimate triumph or his undoing. For Detective Rivera, the final confrontation loomed as the culmination of months of relentless pursuit and personal sacrifice. The map from the farmhouse safe house had led her to the derelict LCBO, its once bright facade now a crumbling reminder of a bygone era. With her team assembled, Rivera entered the building, every step measured and deliberate. The air was heavy with decay and the residue of long-forgotten secrets. Every shadow seemed to whisper of unspeakable crimes. In the darkened corridors, Rivera's instincts sharpened. The clues, the journal entries, the cryptic tokens, the hidden notes had all led here. She moved quietly, her eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Somewhere in these halls, Lurch was orchestrating his final masterpiece, and she was determined to stop him before another life was claimed. The tension escalated as Rivera's team began to secure the building, room by room. Outside, the city's heartbeat faltered with the weight of impending doom, every resident unaware that the climax of a long, dark chapter was about to unfold. And inside, as the final countdown began, Lurch's genius for chaos would soon be tested against the unyielding resolve of justice. In the final moments, as the triggers were set and the stage was ready for the final act, fate and choice intertwined in a dramatic climax. Rivera, guided by a blend of intuition, painstaking evidence, and the raw determination of someone who had lost too much, advanced on the location where she believed Lurch was orchestrating his grand design. The ensuing confrontation was a maelstrom of emotion, violence, and calculated strategy. Gunshots rang out in the echoing halls of the decaying LCBO, and in the chaos, Lurch made his move. For a brief, shattering moment, the paths of predator and pursuer converged in a flash of movement, a collision of two forces driven by opposing ideologies, one seeking retribution, the other clinging to the belief that chaos was its own kind of order. The details of that final clash remain obscured by the fog of night and the chaos of battle. What is clear, however, is that the encounter left both sides irrevocably changed. In the aftermath, as debris settled and the cries of wounded echoed through the ruined corridors, Detective Rivera emerged battered but resolute, a silent promise burning in her eyes. The reign of the Burlington Reaper would end, even if it cost her everything. Lurch's fate, however, remained shrouded in ambiguity. In the chaos of that fateful night, he vanished once more, a shadow slipping through the cracks of a world that had finally begun to close in on him. The city of Burlington, scarred by his dark legacy, was left with a lingering question. Was this the final act of a monster, or merely the prelude to a new chapter in an endless cycle of terror? In the weeks that followed, the city slowly began to rebuild. Detective Rivera's team combed through every scrap of evidence left behind, piecing together the fragmented story of a killer who had both terrified and fascinated them. The cryptic tokens were eventually compiled into a dossier, a grim testament to the mind of Leonard Lurch, Calloway. Meanwhile, in the undercurrents of Burlington's criminal landscape, whispers persisted that the Reaper was still out there, watching, waiting, and preparing for his inevitable return. For Rivera, the final confrontation was both a victory and a personal loss. Every night as she sat in her modest apartment, poring over case files and the FR. On a cold, starless night, as the city slept under a blanket of uneasy silence, Lurch moved once again. Disguised in a nondescript coat and hat, he navigated through the labyrinthine back streets with a singular purpose. His destination was the old LCBO building, a relic that now served as a decaying monument to his former life. Inside, he had planted the seeds of his final masterpiece. Hidden behind false walls and abandoned stockrooms, his intricate network of traps and signals was set to trigger a chain reaction of chaos. It was there, in that decaying edifice, that Lurch planned to tie together every loose end. The old grudges, the final tokens, the silent voices of his past victims. In his mind, every detail was perfect. He had anticipated the detective's moves, manipulated the very fabric of the city's fear, and now, as he prepared to vanish into the night once more, he allowed himself a moment of dark satisfaction. Yet the final act was a gamble, a risk that, if miscalculated, would bring the full force of the law crashing down upon him. In that fleeting moment before the triggers were set off, Lurch's thoughts wandered to the path that had led him here. Every murder, every near miss with capture, every whispered accusation in the dark had been a step along this dangerous road. And as he stepped away from the LCBO, leaving behind the chaos that he had carefully designed, he wondered if this final act would be his ultimate triumph or his undoing. For Detective Rivera, the final confrontation loomed as the culmination of months of relentless pursuit and personal sacrifice. The map from the farmhouse safe house had led her to the derelict LCBO, its once bright facade now a crumbling reminder of a bygone era. With her team assembled, Rivera entered the building, every step measured and deliberate. The air was heavy with decay and the residue of long-forgotten secrets. Every shadow seemed to whisper of unspeakable crimes. In the darkened corridors, Rivera's instincts sharpened. The clues, the journal entries, the cryptic tokens, the hidden notes had all led here. She moved quietly, her eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Somewhere in these halls, Lurch was orchestrating his final masterpiece, and she was determined to stop him before another life was claimed. The tension escalated as Rivera's team began to secure the building, room by room. Outside, the city's heartbeat faltered with the weight of impending doom. Every resident, unaware that the climax of a long, dark chapter was about to unfold. And inside, as the final countdown began, Lurch's genius for chaos would soon be tested against the unyielding resolve of justice. In the final moments, as the triggers were set, and the stage was ready for the final act, fate and choice intertwined in a dramatic climax. Rivera, guided by a blend of intuition, painstaking evidence, and the raw determination of someone who had lost too much, advanced on the location where she believed Lurch was orchestrating his grand design. The ensuing confrontation was a maelstrom of emotion, violence, and calculated strategy. Gunshots rang out in the echoing halls of the decaying LCBO, and in the chaos, Lurch made his move. For a brief, shattering moment, the paths of predator and pursuer converged in a flash of movement, a collision of two forces driven by opposing ideologies. one seeking retribution, the other clinging to the belief that chaos was its own kind of order. The details of that final clash remain obscured by the fog of night and the chaos of battle. What is clear, however, is that the encounter left both sides irrevocably changed. In the aftermath, as debris settled and the cries of wounded echoed through the ruined corridors, Detective Rivera emerged battered but resolute, a silent promise burning in her eyes. The reign of the Burlington Reaper would end, even if it cost her everything. Lurch's fate, however, remained shrouded in ambiguity. In the chaos of that fateful night, he vanished once more, a shadow slipping through the cracks of a world that had finally begun to close in on him. The city of Burlington, scarred by his dark legacy, was left with a lingering question. Was this the final act of a monster, or merely the prelude to a new chapter in an endless cycle of terror? In the weeks that followed, the city slowly began to rebuild. Detective Rivera's team combed through every scrap of evidence left behind, piecing together the fragmented story of a killer who had both terrified and fascinated them. The cryptic tokens were eventually compiled into a dossier, a grim testament to the mind of Leonard Lurch Calloway. Meanwhile, in the undercurrents of Burlington's criminal landscape, whispers persisted that the Reaper was still out there, watching, waiting, and preparing for his inevitable return. For Rivera, the final confrontation was both a victory and a personal loss. Every night, as she sat in her modest apartment, poring over case files and the fractured memories of that night, she wondered if she had truly seen the end of Lurch's reign. But deep in the recesses of her mind, a grim certainty took root. In a city like Burlington, where shadows hold more truth than the light ever can, monsters never truly die. They merely evolve, waiting for the moment to rise again. Leonard Lurch Calloway, wherever he might be hidden now, had left an indelible mark on Burlington. His legacy was etched in the terrified whispers of its citizens, in the headlines that chronicled his heinous acts, and in the relentless pursuit of justice by those who refused to let evil go unchallenged. And as the city tried to heal from its wounds, a cold wind swept through its dark alleys, a silent reminder that the shadow of the Burlington Reaper was never far away. In this final chapter of the current cycle, justice and terror remain locked in a perpetual struggle. For every measure Rivera takes to secure Burlington's safety, the specter of Lurch lingers, an eternal adversary who thrives in the dark corners of a city that once believed it could outpace its own demons. The story is far from over. As long as fear exists and the promise of freedom beckons from the edges of night, there will always be those who operate in the space between light and shadow. And for Detective Rivera, the mission continues, a tireless pursuit of a ghost whose next move is always just one heartbeat away. The final act may have ended in a fiery explosion and a fleeting glimpse of vengeance at the rail yard, but the game remains in motion. Burlington has learned that sometimes the greatest terror is not the act itself, but the relentless pursuit of the unknown, a reminder that the boundary between hunter and hunted is as thin as a whisper in the dark. And so, as the city settles into an uneasy lull and the dawn breaks over a landscape forever changed by the actions of one man, the legacy of Leonard Lurch Calloway endures. His crimes, his cunning, and his ability to vanish into the night have become a cautionary tale, a dark legend woven into the fabric of Burlington's history. The final pages of this chapter may be written in blood and ash, but they also serve as a prelude to a future where the shadows will always harbor secrets, and where the line between justice and terror will forever be blurred. In the end, the story of Leonard Lurch Calloway is a testament to the enduring power of fear, the complexities of redemption, and the eternal dance between order and chaos. Detective Rivera's relentless pursuit reminds us that even in the darkest of nights, there are those who stand against the tide, fighting for a sliver of hope amidst overwhelming despair. And as Burlington learns to rebuild, its citizens carry with them the memory of a man who once ruled the night, a chilling reminder that the past is never truly gone, and that sometimes the monsters we create continue to walk among us. This is the next chapter in the saga of the Burlington Reaper, a continuation that spans betrayal, cunning escapes, and the relentless pursuit of justice in a city that can never fully forget its darkest hours. With each heartbeat, Burlington inches closer to a reckoning that promises to redefine the very nature of fear and redemption in a world where the shadows are as alive as the people who inhabit them. For those who hadn't figured it out by now, Leonard, oh dear Leonard Calloway, the real Hamilton Lurch copycat of Michael Trent,